Galiche, great bird, wood smoke, needle, snake, owl, nopal vibration.
Today we're here with Joe Jimenez and Marina Chávez at the University of California at Santa Barbara. My name is Ben Olguin, and this is Raza World Visions, produced by the Global Latinidades Project. And our activities involve research, an author series, and today we have Joe Jimenez, who will be talking with us about his new book. The title is
Rattlesnake Allegory.
And he read from it last night. Students loved it. We used another one of his books, The Possibilities of Mud, in an undergraduate course in Chicana poetics, and they loved it. So we brought him to campus, and we are fortunate enough to have him here for a very brief interview. Marina Chávez is a fifth-year graduate student in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, and she is working on the complexities of gender identities and navigations of sexuality in ballet folklorico. And so she will be participating in this dialogue. So my first question, if I can, Joe, is how are you using literature to teach us about the complexities of racialized, gendered, sexualized subjectivities?
The first thing that comes to mind when I think about the poems that I make is how I treat brown bodies. And of course, I wouldn't just say a brown body, it would be a brown queer body, and it would always be placed within, time and space and how much money you have or how much money you don't have. And then, of course, when I think about the brown queer body in poetry, particularly the poems I make, I think about desire, and I think about desires that are either regulated and accepted as mainstream, or I think about desires that are considered risky or non-mainstream. What does that mean in poetry? In the poems I make, I like to focus on sound. What is something that I like the way, the words fall off my tongue when I say them out loud? I don't know that I'm a person that really takes much pleasure out of reading my poems out loud as much as I like reading them silently. And I think that speaks maybe to some of the subject matters that I attend to. Some of the poems that I like to write focus on land or focus on meditations about how my body relates to mesquites, for example, or how they relate to egrets or pelicans, as in the possibilities of mud along the Gulf Coast.
We've been talking about, Joe, one of the things that I like about your work is your versatility. You navigate multiple genres, multiple forms of discourse, iambic pentameter, and cholo lyrics. And you're able to engage and readapt Shakespeare and also channel Pablo Neruda's pantheism. So I'm just wondering if you can meditate on or share with us what this is all about, because you're all over the place, yet you're grounded at the same time.
Yeah, I think grounded is a really good word for it, because I think most of the poems that I'm making really are about how my body relates to land. I think there, of course, are photographers who explore this. I think there are artists who explore this, visual artists who explore this, even performance artists like Rafa Esparza. As a writer or as a poem maker, being from South Texas, I want to see what my body does in relationship to words and how the words can be a connection to whether it's mesquite trees or whether it's going to be the salt marshes of the Gulf Coast. When I really think about what my task is, the task that I'm hoping is really exploring what it means to be alive in this particular historical moment and to make poems that maybe wouldn't be expected of a person inhabiting a body like mine. I think early on when I was making poems, I felt really comfortable writing about cholos and ironing and lowriders, because those were the spaces that I felt really familiar with the group of friends I ran with, or with my very first lover. As I've evolved as a writer, I think I've taken more risks to just write about things that I enjoy or that I wonder about. And for me, there's friction there. So in making a poem, I would hope to have some type of friction with what's expected or what's predicted or predictable, and then what's unexpected for me. That can happen in a multitude of ways. One, you can go with the images that I present, or it can be all about the words that I choose to use. But more than that, I think there's also just a sentimiento or a feeling sometimes in the poems that I hope in the poems that I'm making, that wouldn't necessarily come from a body like the one that I'm in, or you wouldn't expect that. And I think that's ultimately one of the tasks of the poems that I'm making, is to articulate masculinity or brown masculinity in a different way.
Yeah, excellent.
Actually, I kind of want to comment on that, because something that I was really struck by when you were giving your poems, as well as when you were, kind of interjecting and talking in the moment to the audience about what you were doing with these poems and what you were thinking and feeling when you were creating them, is there was like this element of radical honesty, I feel, in your work and in the way that you engage with the audience, that was very provocative and powerful. So I was wondering, whether this kind of, radical honesty is a conscious move on your part in trying to make these interventions and performances of masculinity. And
Wow, I've never thought about it in terms of radical honesty. I do think that I try to be honest on the page, but I try to be honest in my life as it is. I think, is it a political act to put myself out there? I think, yeah, certainly. I think sometimes as men, there are certain things we're not supposed to be a part of, or certain things we're not supposed to say. One of those is just the clear admission that we have fears and vulnerabilities. But as I've learned from one of my absolute favorite shows, RuPaul's Drag Race, season 10, Eureka O'Hara says, being vulnerable makes you human, and being human is beautiful. If I'm going to make something that I'm proud of, or that's truthful to who I am, I would go back to another show that I absolutely love, which would be Pose. MJ Rodriguez, who plays the character Blanca, says, shame is not my luxury. Shame is not our luxury. So the moment that I begin to embrace, oh, well, I don't want to say that because it's going to make me look like this, then I'm so caught up in my ego and so caught up in hubris that at the end of the day, it's not me. It's maybe a projection of what I think society wants me to be. As a poem maker, calling it radical honesty, I'm totally jacking that idea.
Go for
Radical
it.
honesty is ultimately what I hope the aim of my writing would be.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And it's also
I am stealing that.
Hey,
Go for it.
please.
I feel honored.
And here's another term that you really are performing is really a critical masculinity. I would even call it a meta-critical masculinity, because you're really reflecting critically and intervening and proposing alternatives to the toxic masculinities that you've exposed in some of your other poetry. I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about critical masculinities.
Sure. I'm a man. I'm happy to claim my shit and put it on the table and claim it. I think that's a really difficult conversation to have with loved ones oftentimes. When I was really young, I remember having this conversation with somebody who was trying to explain male privilege to me. And she started off by saying, sometimes if you walk out to your car at night, and my first thing was like, I'm poor, I don't have a car. What I stopped myself from doing, though, is using that as just a block to actually hear what she was saying. What she explained then was that at night, men typically don't fear being raped when they walk out to their car. That's male privilege. And when I thought about that, I did wonder, gosh, how many times do I remember my mom holding her keys, walking about around a parking lot at night? That moment for me was transgressive because, one, I had to call myself out. I was already ready to be defensive and say, well, that's not true about me because I don't even have a car. What I think what really allowed me to learn was just taking a step back and listening. So I'm hopeful that if people who have maybe pushback to some of the poems I'm making follow that practice and take a step back and really think about what the message is that I'm presenting without objections, without already raising their hand and saying, but, then there's something to be learned, or there's something to be absorbed by just listening to a message, or listening to a poem or a story or an essay.
So your work is performing a major intervention in ways that really make you what we would call a public intellectual. You're someone you're a school teacher, you're an intellectual in the traditional sense, But you're a public intellectual in that you're engaging multiple publics as an author. And I was wondering if maybe you can meditate on that.
I've never thought about the term public intellectual. I definitely think, though, that I try to be aware of who I am and the body I inhabit. The reality is, when you carry positions of privilege, we oftentimes forget the bodies that we're in. I forget that I'm a man sometimes because I just go about living my life, and things I do are not necessarily intentional. Opening the door for somebody, I just do it. At the same time, there are moments when I have to recognize the position that I'm in and even the power that I wield over others or the power that others wield over me. I think just talking about that in some way, shape, or form, I believe that's a way to spread critical consciousness among people. Just saying, hey, dude, oh, bro, you know what happened to me the other day? And just talk about it. What I think ultimately happens when we don't do that is that we just remain silent or we never acknowledge these systems that are working for us or working against us. One of the scary parts for me is just to think about how many times I've been permissive of behaviors or of actions that I really should have spoken out against. If we look at the term public intellectual, I guess just having a conversation or modeling, how to respond to a situation without being destructive or domineering. I think those types of modeled practices, but also the conversations, are rife for people just learning new ways to engage this ever-changing world that we're in. A world that doesn't necessarily, pivot on white, straight men all the time. Ultimately recognizing that, hey, other people want to get shot out of life too.
Yeah, and actually, I'd like to ask you a question as well about. I've noticed that there have been several times now where you start talking about your critical, self-reflective moments on your embodiment and the way people perceive you and your performance of masculinity. And when you talk about those moments, you often anchor it in interaction or something you've seen in the women in your life. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you could comment a little more explicitly about the role that the women in your life have played in your kind of construction of your own masculinity.
Yeah, I was raised by a single mom. I think the bravest thing my mom ever did, as I talked about last night at the reading, was not running back to my dad when he left her or when he left us. I think it took a lot of courage. But and one of the things my mom has said repeatedly is that she does recognize that if she would have stayed or gone back, then my brother and I might have turned out just like him. The terrifying thought would be, wow, that really is a possibility, that if my mother wouldn't have made this big giant sacrifice, which is a sacrifice, of course, of being alone, not having an education, not having a job, and just the loneliness and the fear that goes along with that, this big sacrifice she made ultimately allowed me, one, to not have to grow up with that negative influence in my life, but two, it created this big giant void. So how exactly would I learn to be a man if I didn't have a dad? One of the things that has really been difficult for me is there are things that men are expected to do, and if you don't know how to do them, if you don't know the difference between this wrench and that one, or you can't change a flat tire, it's almost as if there's something flawed about you as a man. Having to learn these things, I learned from lovers, I've learned from friends, I've learned from butch lesbians, I've learned from books and YouTube tutorials on how to get things done. I would be very fearful, though, the type of person I would be had I not been allowed to see other ways to be a man, that I only would have had just one model, this is the way or the highway. I think that's dangerous for boys growing up.
Absolutely. So one of the roles you have really is almost as a surrogate father to youth through your own young adult literature. And I was wondering if you can talk about why you turned to young adult literature.
Almost by coincidence, really, I turned to YA literature. I like poems. I'm a part of the Macondo writing workshops. The year that I was going to attend, there were no poetry workshops. They were just fiction. And there was one person whose name I saw that I want to work with her. And that was Reina Grande. So I put together 10 pages of fiction, and I sent it in, and we workshopped it. And I will be eternally grateful to Reina Grande for mentoring me and building my confidence as a poet who could also write prose. I really went into the workshop wanting to learn about prose. I came out of the workshop believing, in large part because of the people in the workshop, and especially Reina Grande, that I actually could make a book or make a story out of these little 10 pages that I put together. When I think about how that would serve as a model or a mentor for young people, I think some of the questions I have just as a human, I think they're also the questions that young people have. As a high school teacher, some of the conversations that I've had with students over the years, that's some of the craziest questions. Some of the questions are heartbreaking. Some of the questions are profound and eye-opening. For the most part, if I think about radical honesty, I think of high school students. Some of them just willing to put the caca on the table and say, "Hey, I want to know about this." One of the questions that I've encountered in the past has been about how do you learn to be a good guy, or can you teach somebody to be good? And those conversations with young people ultimately helped shape the question, how do you become a good guy if you don't have a dad in your life, or if you don't have a male role model in your life, which was the impetus for Bloodline, the first young adult novel. The second young adult novel, the one that I was actually revising this morning, and hopefully to turn in by the end of the summer, it's a similar question, and it's a question that is one that personally I think about men in my family who've done horrible things, and how after the fact, how we have the choice, or how I have the choice, to either forgive them and move on, or to be angry at them, recognizing they hurt people and they really ruined people's lives. What do I make of that? Well, that's the project of the book, Drown the Wind. I don't have an easy answer for those questions, but I do think as I explore it and as I revise, I'm really hopeful that the message I send out into the world is one that is rooted in just the reality of it. Bad things happen to people. They have a right to be pissed off. You can't just snap your fingers and say, "Hey, everything's cool now," because somebody says it's supposed to be all right, or we're supposed to be hopeful or optimistic. When I'm on my back, any yell can be a needle. Any breath works as thread.
One thing that really strikes me, and again, I just love hearing you talk, because you're just breaking it down. You're keeping it real. You're keeping it, gangster, man. I mean, you're ethical gangster. I mean, you're just breaking it down, and you're presenting things that sometimes don't have easy answers. A term that you use repeatedly in discussing your work that also I think keeps it real in ways that a lot of writers don't is you call yourself a poem maker. You're referring to yourself as a worker. There's a labor sensibility there, because it's work. It's mostly revision, right? You spend most of your time revising. That's what being a writer is. So could you talk about why you use the term poem maker?
I use the term poem maker because I learned it from another writer named Elena Ellis, and we attended the MFA program at Antioch University LA together. I love her, I respect her work, and I love the vision and the voice that she brings to the world. I heard her say one time, and I've read her write about making poems, or being a poem maker, and how it's embracing the aesthetic of almost like creating a piece of furniture almost. There is an art and a craft to it, and I do think that's true about making poems. I'm not super poem maker in the sense that I can just write something and it's awesome right away. I have to go back 2 months later, 3 weeks later, 2 years later, and go back and dig and redig and find different ways to rework it. When I say find ways to rework it, I would say work, W-E-R-Q, in the really queer sense, because some of the ideas that I present then through revision would ultimately be about subversion, or about, if I make this, is it going to reify things that people already believe about queer brown men, or is it going to challenge those assumptions? How does power fit in? What power do I have in saying this or not saying this? I think being conscious and aware of those issues and the power that the pen really wields in terms of either endorsing a system or challenging a system, for me, that's one of the things I love about poetry and about making poems. It really is about the possibility of what can be done or what can be undone.
Amazing.
Yeah. Actually, there's something that is coming up, and it came up last night as well, or yesterday in the panel when a few of the other scholars were talking about, collectivity and, this idea that we all, as human beings and in communities and societies, that we all interdepend on each other, right? And that for that reason, forgiveness needs to be like possible or
Right.
should be possible. And you're saying, well, no, it's not always possible, and it's not always the right thing for everyone.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of your specific experiences and how that you see that in your work. Because at the same time, I know you're saying it's not exactly all optimistic all the time, but I feel like the fact that you're putting yourself out there with this radical honesty and you're opening yourself up and making yourself vulnerable, that speaks to an optimism, I believe.
Sure. Well, thank you. Personal experience, I would just go straight to one of the greatest hurts I've experienced in life. When I left this relationship I was in, the other person forged my name on a deed, and I tried to evict him through the justice system. We went to civil court, and in court, his best friend and his daughter said that we'd had a commitment ceremony and that in this ceremony I'd signed this deed and given him half of my house. And the judge believed them over me. I felt like I had told the truth and that I was betrayed by the justice system. In terms of forgiveness, I think I have the right to be as angry as I want to be. I think that other people telling someone, and I can think of other personal situations, which I don't want to put on the table now, but that's the one I'm thinking of that I would like to share. Other people telling us to, forgive so-and-so. I think it's more about their comfort than it really is about the person who's suffering. I take, for example, my mother's advice to, you have to make peace with this. You have to forgive this. You have to give it up to God. I do recognize that as a human, I have the right to feel angry over injustice. Will I feel angry over these injustices my entire life? I don't know. But I do think that I'm just recognizing that no one else can dictate feelings, or that no one else can present a rule book for how you manage your own feelings. I think that's it's empowering just to recognize you're not going to own the way I feel. I think falling into the trap of letting other people puppet our feelings, I think that's ultimately why we oftentimes find ourselves in these self-destructive behaviors or in behaviors that don't necessarily benefit us, because we've been trained or socialized to forgive and forget, or to it's just one time, it won't happen again. After the third or fourth time, we're like, well, that's just the way they are. You've stayed this long, so okay. You must be okay with it on some level. Those are really dangerous conversations because they end up reifying practices that already exist in people's lives. Dangerous and self-destructive practices.
Yeah, and I'm really struck by that because as women, we're socialized to especially forgive and forget, and anger is like not an acceptable, expression in women. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think young men are socialized to feel or not feel and express or not express anger, and how you are trying to kind of recraft your relationship to anger.
Yeah, that's a really hard question because
Sorry.
the first thing that pops in my head is, okay, what are the things we tell people when they're mad? Go punch your pillow.
Yeah.
Go play a sport, go work out. Sometimes, or go write in your journal. Sometimes those things don't work. So finding something that actually manages or that allows a release of anger. I think of the conversation we had yesterday about Irene Lara Silva's Grito workshop. I think for me, there are multiple ways to throw a grito, not just with your voice. I think, and it sounds crazy, but I think dancing, is a way to throw a grito. I think sleeping is a way to throw a grito. I think self-love or self-care, those are forms of gritando. I think sitting there holding my dogs or running with them at the river, those are ways to gritar. I don't know exactly what the remedy is for anger, but I do know that sometimes there are conditions or feelings for which there may not be a remedy. It should just be allowed to be, and to be allowed to be. When I think of sometimes this conversation I had once about, well, does love ever really end? I was told by a woman I respect a lot that no, love doesn't ever end. It just changes its form. Does grief ever end? No, it just becomes something else. I think maybe that's true for anger as well. I don't know that my anger over situations has ever really ended. It's just taken a different form, whether it's poems or playing with my dogs or trying to get big arms, whatever it is. There's a way I think that that I've tried to navigate those feelings without hurting other people. And I think that's the caveat, without hurting others or hurting myself.
That's an amazing vision, because it just kind of gives us, the opportunity to sigh and say, okay, this is okay to feel this way. You mentioned your arms. Talk about your tattoos, if you don't mind. I hope that's not too intrusive,
no.
but they're beautiful. It's beautiful art. How does that work into your own poetic sensibility?
Well, I think I'm a verbal linguistic learner because most of the tattoos I have are words. If I think about maybe somebody else who wasn't so attuned to language, maybe their body would be covered in more pictures or images than words. Some of the words that I have aguanto on one arm, which I got when I was really young, and I think sometimes with tattoos, at that time I didn't recognize, wow, tattoos will create musculature or work against musculature. So putting a straight line down your arm really isn't flattering to the body if you're wanting to have your arms look a certain way. At the same time, though, on my back, I have good times and bad times. In there, I have 2 spider webs on my shoulder caps. Why I got good times and bad times, I used to love Smile Now, Cry Later, the song by Sunny Osuna, I think, right? I love that song. And then I love the drama mask, but I didn't want to put the drama masks on my body. What I did want to put on my body, though, were clowns. For some reason, I've been fascinated by clowns. Not Twisty, no. The creepy ones, no. But growing up, seeing clowns on, the swap meet T-shirts, or remember the little stickers that they had, or the homies, El Payaso? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I really like that. And so it's just something that I liked, and I wanted to include. So I have a portrait here. One of them is supposed to be me, and the other one is my first lover, and we both have the markings of the clowns over our eyes. I have 3 crosses on this wrist, and that would just represent Christianity, or not Christianity, but forgiveness, which is an issue very clearly that I struggle with. My mom has a devotion to El Sagrado Corazón, so I have on this arm a Sacred Heart in the shape of a nopal. And then on this arm, I have the more traditional Sacred Heart with La Virgen de Guadalupe's name across it. And that day was especially important to me because someone I cared very deeply about passed away on the day, December 12th, that we honor her. Across my stomach, I have Atzlan. And I laughed at the time because it was like, what do you put on your stomach? Well, you claim your set, right? Where you're from. And so as a young Chicano, as somebody with big brown eyes, I wanted to claim that I was from Atzlan by writing it over my stomach. Across my chest, I have, it's not the smiley face, it's the frown nameplate. And it says, God bless the dead. I think as a queer brown man, recognizing so many people that were lost in the 80s, the 90s, and even into the 2000s, but particularly in those 2 decades. I always want to remember that. I never want to forget that. And one of the poems that I'm most proud of is a poem entitled Mezquites, where I talk about a field of mezquites and how something happened. The mezquites were happy, and they were living wildly and shamelessly, growing in all these weird, twisted, contortions. And if you've seen mesquite trees, this is what they do, right? They take all these weird, crooked angles in the way the limbs grow. But then something happened, and some disease hit the mezquites, so that so many of the mezquites died or died off. Over time, new mezquites came about and grew in this field. The new mezquites, however, didn't always recognize or even care about the fact that mezquites were there before them and they're not here any longer. It's a poem ultimately that I really love because it speaks to something that that I do care about, which is the generations of queer people, particularly men, when I see younger people. But it happens in other communities as well, where young people aren't conscious or aware of all the sacrifices that have been made to give us the things we have now. Ultimately, that was the idea I was working with, is trying to reconcile within myself the freedoms that young people enjoy, because in large part sacrifices were made, people died, people were hurt in order for us to get what we have now.
And thank you. It's been a joy speaking with you. I was wondering if you have any closing remarks about this upcoming book.
The new book is entitled Rattlesnake Allegory. I go back to that metaphor that I've used before about believing your entire life that you're supposed to be in Gryffindor, and then one day you're like, what? I'm really Slytherin, and that's okay, that being flawed or being imperfect or liking weird shit is not the end of the world. It doesn't make you a bad person. I would hope that that with this particular collection of poems, I would hope that the message I put out into the world is more than just, oh, look, these are poems about owls, these are poems about mesquite trees, these are poems about armadillos, but ultimately that as people looking at our relationship to land, with land, and by land is certainly a way to reimagine our future. Having been distanced from land so long, especially those of us who have roots in tierra, to really see ourselves in relationship to the lands we inhabit. I think that's a way to re-envision where we're going and what we'll do in these future years.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And who still speaks the languages of víboras and caliche? And who will reteach my body that language of great birds and nopal?
Aprendimos a quererte desde la histórica altura donde el sol de tu bravura le puso cerco a la muerte.
Aquí se queda la clara, la entrañable y transparente